Alrighty, so I've got another tournament recap for you. This is the tournament that happened on September 7th and September 8th over in Spain. This was a 258-man event. So one of, if not the biggest Star Wars Unlimited tournaments we've had so far. Now, I know I'm getting this video out a couple days after the actual tournament, so please do let me know if this is still something that you think is valuable, even though it didn't come out right after the event itself. All right. So what was the event? The structure was a 2-day event, 258 players is a ton. We had 8 rounds of a Swiss tournament on the first day, and then they actually cut to top 64. So that's a ton of people, right? So the second day was kind of a whole nother tournament. It was a single elimination tournament. So 6 rounds for the 2 finalists. They got to play all 6 rounds. So the rest of this video is going to be a little more off the cuff than usual. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just open up the tournament document from Limitless. Now, it's a great, they have a ton of data in this, the way they run their website. So I really like it for kind of analyzing tournaments. And what I'm going to do is simply have that up here and we're going to go through, how I would review this on my own. Okay. So over here, we've got the breakdown. Now this is right here. If you would click Metagame, you would see the breakdown of the leaders. So again, the top 4 is actually the exact same top 4 from the UK event. It was Boba Fett. They're not in the same order though, but yeah. So I did open up the Manchester UK event from the previous week too, so we could kind of compare and start accumulating data, try to understand what's happening with the metagame, what decks are succeeding. So over in Spain here, we had almost 21% meta share for Boba, a 17% for Sabine, almost 15% for the young Han 2, and then a little over 10% for Qi'ra. After that, it drops pretty substantially down to 5% for Palpatine, 4% Rey. Now we're really, it's much less, although it's still a handful of people because this was a 258-person event. There were 13 Emperor Palpatines, for instance, and 11 Reys made up 4.2% of the meta. If we want to compare that a little bit to what happened in the UK event, which I think is useful, I think the only way we can really start isolating and understanding what's changing and what's happening is to actually compare this to stuff, because it's really hard to compare data to its own data set. So here we've got at the UK event, we had Sabine actually was the first at 17%, Boba, Han, and Qi'ra were the next 3. So it's the same 4 as the top 4, just Sabine and Boba were kind of flipped. And then from then on, it was Bosk at 9%, which is similar to what Palpatine, and then everything else after that was much, much lower. All right, so we kind of know what showed up, right? We're going to look at win percentages. Now this, again, it's useful. You get an aggregate amount of how much did Boba win in this event? It was 54%. So it's a good record, right? Over 50 is good. Sabine, on the other hand, 53%, similar. Han Solo, 50%, and Qi'ra, 49%. So those 2 decks were very 50-50 during this event. We're going to try to understand what's happening. I'm going to open up each of these decks to actually see breakdowns for how they did overall into different archetypes. If you want to compare that to the UK event, those top 3 were actually did much better there. It was 54% win rate for Sabine, 58% for Boba, and 55% for Han. But Qi'ra over there in the UK was 45%. Now, Qi'ra in back-to-back events now is under 50%. So that's notable. I mean, I know anyone who's watching me for not the first time knows that I think Qi'ra is a very good deck, and I won an event with Qi'ra, and I've seen other people win events with Qi'ra, but it is still trending in a way where even though it's winning events and sometimes doing really well, the overall majority of the Qi'ra, the win rate there might be lower than what I would think matches based on what I think of the deck. But again, that's just what I think of the deck, and the numbers disagree, and we're going to have to try to figure out why and parse that out. Okay, so so we see this meta, we see the win rates of the top decks. Like if you want to see here, like Bosk had 7 people, but it was almost a 60% win rate. But I mean, a lot of that is going to do with one particular Bosk who ran really hot at this event. So let's click on Boba Fett and see. We get to see like all the players, right? Their records. So there was an 11-2 Boba. That was the best. That means they played 13 rounds, which would have put them in the top 4, right? 14 rounds would have been if you made it to the finals in day 2. After that, it kind of drops down. I mean, you have a lot that are having winning records, right? 8 wins, 7 wins, 6 wins. Even some of the 5 wins were winning records, but they didn't make it into the top 64. But looks like to be pretty well-rounded. But we'd actually need to look even further in this because Boba, there's actually more than one kind of Boba, right? So if you click on the cards tab here, you can actually see what like the overall amount of cards was showing up in each deck. It's a little, I wish the bases didn't actually separate by all the base types because I would rather it would just separate by either 30 health or color, because now I need to actually try to figure out what percentage we're running mono yellow and what percentage we're running green or a different color. I mean, we see like Tarkin Town at a 2%, right? That's very low. Jabba's Palace is yellow. Administrator's Tower is yellow. Chopper Base is yellow. A bunch of these, I mean, I don't even remember all of them, but the majority of these are yellow. We can probably, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to look at Cunning, the card Cunning, because that's a double yellow card. And it's almost always just in the 3 of in the mono yellow. So it's 1.59 Cunnings per deck, which would mean about every 2 decks you were getting 3 Cunnings or 0 Cunnings, right? So I would say a little over half the field was in mono yellow and the rest was mostly green and then a little bit of like blue and red. I think that's just cool, especially with leaders that we know are getting played in with multiple base types. That's a way for you to kind of like figure out what they were running, and you can even see like what cards were showing up all the time, right? We have 2.85 Fett's Fire Sprays per deck, which means some people out there were not playing 3 Fett's Fire Sprays in their Boba decks, and it's probably people playing Control, although you can certainly play 3 Fire Sprays there. All right, matchups is kind of my favorite. Wait, no, not this. Sorry. Like I said, this is a little bit off the cuff. Oh yeah, okay, so matchups. I was right the first time. You can see how this deck matched up into other leaders. Now, a lot of these, I think, are like not going to give you very much information, like 6-0 against Bo-Katan. Sure. One person beat an IG with Boba. I don't think that's the stuff that matters. It's the ones that are like the high representation, right? So here we go. Sabine, 45 wins, 27 losses. That's a 62% win rate against Sabine. Now I want to look real quick at how the win rate Boba had in Manchester versus Sabine. It was 77% against Sabine. So Boba's consistently, at least through those 2 events, doing really well into Sabine. I think that is mostly something people agree on, that Boba is favored in that matchup. Not like dramatically, although 62% I'd say is pretty dramatic, but maybe not that dramatic among type play, but certainly Boba trends in favored there. So what else has a lot of data? There's Palpatine, for instance. Boba went 14-10 against Palpatine, actually 14-11. I think the draws are double losses when it comes to this software. So Boba beating Palpatine is not great news for Palpatine, because I really think Palpatine needs to succeed into that matchup in order to be justified, because we know it's just not going to succeed overall into Sabine's. Again, I'll talk a little bit about like what I think these percentages mean in a moment. I just want to go through this a little more. Han Solo, Boba was actually a little unfavored, 47% win rate, and then also 45% into Qi'ra. So those 2 decks, which are 2 of the top 4 represented decks, maybe Boba struggling at least a little bit into them, but overall, it wasn't getting really trounced there, and it was definitely trouncing a lot of other things, including kind of clean sweeps against all the like weird stuff in the meta. So Boba's obviously a very good deck. I can't tell you exactly which ones of these were like green, and if green did better against a different one. That I would have to click into every single player. But before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about like how I look at these stats and how much weight I put onto them, because in reality, right now, I think the stats and like the matchup data we get is going to be skewed a ton based on something kind of very practical, and that is that the better player, or the more experienced player, or the player that knows the matchup better, gets a lot of points no matter what they're playing into. And so picking up on these trends is great, right? We're getting data, but we don't know if some of these wins were purely because someone messed up in a game, or didn't understand their role in a particular matchup, right? The game isn't still incredibly young, and these events towards the top cut, you definitely start seeing much tighter play, but during the Swiss portions, you sometimes don't, frankly. I don't have any, I'm not like calling out anything in particular here with this data. Most of this tracks sort of to what I internally test and like what I figure out. I would say, if you wanted like my off the cuff opinion here, I think the Sabine matchup is actually closer than 62%. I think the Qi'ra matchup is actually worse than 45%. And I don't think Boba should be losing more than they win against young Han, but like nothing here is so dramatic that I would say throw this data out. I just want to relay that you have to be still a little skeptical with reading into this stuff, because there is a lot besides leader matchup that goes into winning a match. We don't just run simulations where it's 100 robots with even skill playing against each other, and then 62% of the time Boba beats Sabine, so it's a 62% matchup. There's no robots playing yet, so we still have human error built into the results, and that is very important. So you need to not only look at this data, but you need to understand your own experiences and like what you feel in your games is favored or unfavored. And then also try to listen to people who you trust, who know how to play a certain matchup, and maybe are doing something different in a matchup that you didn't think of. And all of a sudden that matchup that you thought was bad might not be so bad, but since most people aren't doing it, that data gets skewed. All right, we are going to look at some more. We're going to do the top cut, definitely. Well, not all 64. I'm not opening 64 deck lists, but I want to look at a few others. So let's look at Sabine, and this is going to be almost entirely Energy Conversion Lab, so I'm not going to look at matchup cards, but all right, let's look at how Sabine did. So 28 and 12, 70% win rate against Qi'ra. That's a lot. 10 and 5 against Palpatine. Honestly, I'd expect that number to be much higher than Sabine's win rate into Qi'ra, but it's not this time. They were also beating up on young Han, 32-21. Went 4 and 3 against old Han. Now, old Han was very underrepresented in this event. What else? We know how it did against Boba, so those were kind of the new data here. So I'm gonna open that up on the Manchester event too, just to see if we can kind of see any differences. So in the Manchester event, Sabine was also beating up on young Han at a 65% win rate. So it was very close, actually. So that's consistent. It was a 50-50 into Qi'ra at Manchester. So much larger data here. We can try to think about why. One hypothesis maybe is Qi'ra's base choice. I personally don't think that should change the matchup percentage that much, but we're going to figure out if maybe that did. Other than that, I'd say overall, it was pretty consistent, right? Sabine also got slaughtered by Boba at the UK event. It's not something I'd like if I was picking Sabine. I think that Sabine is such an incredibly powerful deck. It's just tough sometimes. If that matchup truly is that one-sided, right? Like over 60% or close to 70% in Boba's favor. It's tough because Boba is going to be either the number 1 represented deck or the number 2 represented deck in an event, and you don't really want to be that much of a dog, like an underdog to one of the top 2 represented decks in a metagame. All right. So I'm gonna do Young Han in a moment. I just want to do the Qi'ra first because we did identify Qi'ra got obliterated by Sabine at this event, but did not get obliterated by Sabine at the UK event. Was there something a little different? So it was almost 80% energy conversion lab at the Spain event, and it was, let's see, it was 61%. Now, much smaller sample size here, but yeah, it was still more energy conversion lab, just not as much. I don't think there's anything specific in that should indicate that like that's why Sabine crushed Qi'ra and went from like a 50-50 matchup to a 70-30. I also just internally, again, I don't think it is at all a 70-30 matchup with energy conversion lab or without. Qi'ra should, with tight play, have way more game into Sabine than that. But overall, I can't tell you exactly why that's happening. You want to see something weird? I actually looked at this a little before because I knew that Qi'ra did very poorly into Sabine. So I wanted to see kind of how they did into other stuff. So here is Kira's matchup spread. Now, it was favored into Boba at this event. 24 and 21, not that that's some major statistics, but it's 8 and 10 into Boba, the UK event. But I think the most notable one here is the Young Han. So Qi'ra went 22 and 14 for a 61% win rate into Young Han. And you want to see what Young Han did to Qi'ra over at the UK? It was 6 and 15 into Young Han, so 28% win rate. So between 2 events a week apart, Qi'ra went from a 28% win rate to Young Han to a 61% win rate into Young Han. And no amount of looking at deck lists or explaining data to me is going to convince me that such a dramatic change has anything to do other than pilot variance. Nothing dramatic changed between these decks or how these matchups play in 7 days. So because of this is like my best argument for this is, look, data matters, but play matters more right now. And it's really hard to evaluate this data without knowing the context in which the players are playing, right? We don't know if everyone's playing tightly. We don't know if people are picking up new lists and trying them. We don't know if people have tested any particular matchup that much. So Qi'ra, though, in back-to-back events is not done so well, right? We did have one that went 9 and 2. They made a decent run into the. They were 6 and 2 in the Swiss, and then I think they won 2 rounds in the top 64 and then lost. 6 and 3 was the other one that made it into the top cut, but then lost their first round. If you want to see the list, the one that went 9 and 2 was an energy conversion lab list. They had, the low drops. They had 3 Consortium Star Vipers, so they were trying to hedge a little more anti-aggro with that, hoping that heal was going to be relevant. They had a Rivals Fall and 1 Super Laser Blast in the main deck. Maybe Del Mico's is a little different than what we see recently, but maybe this player expected some more hard control, and Del Mico does have a way of sometimes messing up very key turns for those decks. But overall, I'm not going to say there's major shifts in this deck. I can look at the 6 and 3 version. This was also an energy conversion lab. This one looks familiar. I'm going to say it's very similar to the list I had at Gen Con, if not exactly the same. I'm not going to read it card for card, but the top 2 lists were both energy conversion lab. I'm not going to open any more, but it looks like most of the rest were like 5 and 4s, 4 and 4s, and then you start scrolling down, you get the 3 and 5s, right? Like this deck basically went 50-50 at this event, right? It was a 49.07%. So Qi'ra is kind of a 50-50 deck. It's a kind of deck that has game into most things. It does sometimes feel like it's getting overrun by something like Sabine. Like, you really notice the games you get crushed by Sabine because they're really in your face. But I still think, personally, from my own playtesting, that it's still an incredibly good choice. 30 health, 25 health, varying card choices, I think still really good. All right, I'm going to look at Young Han. It's another deck that I like a lot, especially like the blue-red Young Han. I want to see really quickly, so it looks almost entirely, it was about 90% blue, and then 11% energy conversion lab, and like 3% red, mono red. So I actually like mono red Han. Also, I like green Han. I think this leader is just really good. Like, resource cheating, it's just good. Han is going to be a player, I think, kind of consistently. I am wondering why I never see security complex being played as a base with him. You know, I think that it might be decent. So overall, we're viewing this deck as a red blue deck, and that is kind of what the default Han is at this point. The deck itself played pretty well. It had a 51% win rate into Boba. It was pretty unfavored, though, like heavily into both Sabine and Qi'ra at this event, which is, again, that's a problem. Consistently, we're seeing the same 4 decks being the top players at a metagame, so having bad matchups into 2 of them is not great. I think you can have bad matchups into 1 of them, because it's kind of impossible to have good matchups into all 4. But you don't want like 40% into Sabine and 40% into Qi'ra. I know a lot of people and like that play Blue Han think it's quite good into Qi'ra. I play Blue Han. Also, I don't think that matchup is that favored for Han. I think it's a pretty close matchup in general. So I wouldn't say that I think Han should be 38% into Qi'ra. I think it should be better than that. But I also wouldn't go and then look at the UK version and say Han should, that Qi'ra should be 28% into Han, right? I think the answer is somewhere in between these two. I also think Han needs to definitely respect Sabine a little more sometimes. And the more greedy you get with your top end and your grindy stuff like techs and the big stuff, the more you start sacrificing into Sabine. So Han, still a very good deck. Don't get me wrong. It had a 50% win rate here. It was very similar to Qi'ra. It is another one of those decks that I don't think gets like blown out a lot. It should have game into all the top contenders, and it might just need a little tightening up. But overall, again, I'm looking at this data. I'm trying to pick up trends, especially between this and the other event that happened at in the UK, and see if we start picking up trends. So far, we're seeing some, right? I'm seeing Boba being consistently favored into Sabine. I'm seeing Qi'ra consistently performing under a 50% win rate. I'm seeing Palps losing to Sabine's. Han being somewhere in the 50-50 deck range, right? There is some stuff we're picking up on, but we still have a long way to go, especially when we can't account for like variance in terms of like player comfort with decks and like piloting and stuff like that. Okay, ready for the top 64, I guess. This is what happened. So 31% of the top 64 was Boba's, 20 of them. So that actually is, I think, a little that's overrepresented, right? The Bobas started at 21% of the meta, and they ended up with 31%. That is very powerful. Sabine, on the other hand, also 20% of the meta, started at 17, so it also overperformed a little bit. Han, 15%. Qi'ra, 9% of the... actually, 6 Qi'ras made the top 64. I apologize before. I thought it was only 2. 6 Qi'ras. The top 6 here all made it. And then I guess some people at 5. Oh, the 5 and 4s. Okay. The 5 and 4s here made it. They were 5 and 3 when they made it, and then they lost their first round. So all the Qi'ras, or all but one of the Qi'ras here, lost in their first round in the top 64. One Qi'ra, the one that finished with 9 wins, won their first 2 rounds. So those are the top 4. They all, Qi'ra, about the same. Qi'ra and Han and Sabine were all pretty close to like what their initial percentages started with and how many actually made it into the top cut. Boba far exceeded that. And you can see here that Sabine, Han, and Qi'ra, all in that order, had an under 50% win rate in the top cut. All right. Who else did good in the top cut? Cad Bane did pretty good, but it was only 2 players. And then this one Bosk, who went 6-0 and won the whole thing. So we're definitely going to look at that list and see what happened there. So that was the top 64. We are going to go into standings, and this is how we are going to start looking at some decks. So let's open up the winner of this whole event. His name is Jordan. Crushed it with a 12-2 record. That is an obscene amount of games of this to play. He did it with Bosk. Did it with Bosk Blue, which is not something we talk about very much. So it's really cool. And here is the deck list. I'm going to open it as an image. Bam. So, Bosk Blue. This is a hard control deck. This is very unit light. And tons and tons of removal. So we've got like tons of healing, right? There's top targets in the main deck. There's clients in the main deck. Client is nice with Bosk because it you can put a bounty and then use Bosk's ability or double trigger your Bosk leader. You got the 3 vigilance, obviously. This is, and the restock main. So it looks like the player was also using the mill plan, like the deck your opponent out plan, as part of its win condition. He's main decking some discard with pillages. Now there's not a lot of other discards, so I don't know how frequently he was able to really like hard target a hand with that, but gave him some play there. The units themselves, right? Dr. Persian's not really a unit, it's a card draw. Client's barely really a unit, it's just there for healing. But we got Childson, and this is a heavy blue deck, so your Childson was going to be pretty big. 1 Palpatine, 3 Avengers, and 2 crates as kind of like, this is how I beat you with damage. And then the rest is just straight up removal with some more card draw, 3 Super Laser Blast. This looks very similar to like the Vader blue and the Iden red of last set. This is a mill deck that, you know, against non-grindy decks will beat you by attacking you with Avenger a couple times. Like, that's obviously in play here. Will this be a completely new player? I don't know. It might be. I've been messing around with Bosk Blue on the side. I haven't yet found in my own testing a place for it, but I'm certainly going to look now at this list, and it's given me some new ideas, and we'll see, like, can this continue winning, right? Like, this was one player doing really well with Bosk. Bosk barely showed up at this event. I don't think this suddenly means Bosk Blue is tier S, right? I think but we obviously need to look at a new list and try to figure out why it won, how it won, and can it continue winning. All right, that was the Bosk. So 2nd place at this event, David here with Han. This was a Han blue deck. You know, I don't have much to add to this. There's obviously like individual card choices that can change in these decks, but the core of this deck is what it is. It plays big units ahead of curve, highlighted by Luke. It plays the early good red-blue units, a lot of which it also just plays ahead of curve. It's got a discard angle with Force Throw, Pillage, and K2, and it's a good deck. I like this deck. One card that I don't see very much in these decks that I like to play is Forces with Me. I think it gives the deck a little different angle of attacks. Most of the time, what this deck is doing is either playing 1 chunky unit or 1 removal card on a turn. Forces with Me does add a little bit of closing speed to this deck, in like especially late in the game when you're able to just like punch up and then leave behind a threat with a shield that might be able to kill them the next turn, right? Think Forces with Me on Luke, hit your opponent for 8. If they're at 8 or less now, bam, they're in a predicament because there's a shielded Luke in play. All right, I'm going to look at a few more. Here's a Boba Fett. This was the 3rd place deck. This was a mono yellow Boba. See if there's anything new here. So trim down on Bodhies. I talked about that a little bit in the recent video, that I think Bodhi Rook certainly can start getting trimmed from some of these decks, because it's not even all that great sometimes into control decks, especially the Qi'ra decks, mostly because Qi'ra gets a free kill on it and becomes a 7-power unit. But I like Hot Shot Blasters. I like Boba's armor. It's a lot of upgrades with 5, but you know, the Hot Shot Blasters being able to be a free resource is really nice. Forlom Zuckuss is notably very powerful in mirror matches, and I think when Boba is getting played so much, hedging there a little bit is important. Got 3 Bobas and 3 Toro, so it's a ton of ground units, where I've seen some people who play this deck actually kind of pivoting more into space. I see that we were really focusing on the ground here, and that makes sense with the Hot Shot Blasters, right? You've got more ways to buff that Toro and hopefully get some more combos. We got only 1 shoot first, so you know, you hope you draw that into Sabine, and basically that's it. It's like sometimes good at like removing sentinels that are in front of you. Overall, this deck functions decently well into Sabine in general, so it doesn't always need to pivot that much into there. You got Bazines in the sideboard, you got Lurking Ties, certainly some anti-control stuff going on there. All right, let's look at the 4th place. This is a Palpatine, and not too many Palpatines on this list right now, but we're going to look at that one. It was a Coronet City, so this was a yellow Palpatine, which is super cool. Yeah, so yellow Palp, I think like the thing that is like sometimes most enticing about it is like the change of heart stuff, because you get to steal something and then throw it with Palpatine's ability. This is still primarily like a green deck. It's using like early Greedos and maybe ISB Agent to get a little more board state early. I see Sneak Attacks, which is a really nifty thing to include in a Palp deck, especially with like Reinforcement Walker. One thing I'm surprised to not see here is McClunky, because I think that's like one of the best reasons to be in yellow if you're going to play with Palp. You play McClunky, you get Greedos, and you get to play like Crumb, Salacious Crumb, and then you've got all these cheap 1-cost Underworld units that you can throw, and that can really help establish early board control for a deck that struggles a lot with that, especially because you don't have very much removal in these colors. Bazine is notably another Underworld card, so like I really like the idea of playing yellow Palp with McClunky, and I think that's something I'd look to include here. Yeah, they're playing a command in the main deck for extra ramp, even though it costs 6. And Palp's good. You just have to like dodge Sabine for the most part. I want to look at this Cad Bane deck now. This is a 10-2 Cad Bane deck. This is a Cad Bane Tarkin Town. I am a big fan of Cad Bane Tarkin Town. I think Tarkin Town with Cad Bane is an incredibly powerful ability, and they are playing a very light red splash. Something I would also do. So like Punishing One and Ruthless Raider are actually the only red cards I currently have in my Cad Bane deck. But this player barely added any more. It was the Antagonizers as another 1-drop and Daring Raid. Like Hot Shot Blaster is not really a red card. So overall, the Tarkin Town Cad, what this does is let you get board control for kind of from the start of the game, and then from then on your pings become much better because your opponent's board is limited. I think the moment you start letting your opponent get more than 1 unit into play and you're Cad, it's a big issue because his leader ability kind of starts stinking if that happens. Tarkin Town goes a long way in making that not happen very much. So do these ambush units like Cloud Rider and Forlom and Bosk. They really help. McClunky is another tremendous card with Cad Bane, allowing you to do potentially 4 damage to 1 unit or 3 in 1. So the deck itself is really cool. I love that they're playing 3 Jabbas. I love the 3 Sneak Attacks. This deck is speaking to me. One card I'm not a huge fan of. I don't think I would play the Antagonizers. I don't think a 2/3 Saboteur for 1 is all that meaningful. I'd rather just like play maybe like Cartel Spacers. They're Underworld also. You get some more space presence, especially because this deck can struggle into something like TIE Phantom, because that card single-handedly shuts down Cad Bane's ability. Another thing, I like that they're playing Confiscates in the sideboard. I think a way this deck loses to Sabine is Darksaber. A way this deck can lose to Boba is Boba's armor. It's even made me think sometimes that maybe the confiscates need to be in the main deck because those two cards are kind of problematic at times. But yeah, I think Cad Bane red is a solid contender, and this is a cool list, and good job, Adrian. All right, we got to look at least at one Sabine deck. This was the highest placing Sabine deck by Ivan here. It was Sabine Energy Conversion Lab. Not that surprising. So, you got Poe Wrecker, you got Timely Intervention. That all makes sense to me. You got the whole Rebel package. It's all there for the most part. 2 Darksaber. Nah, just run 3. That card is cracked, and it gives the deck free wins. I think too much of the time. I would just play the 3. 1 confiscate in the main deck is very cheeky, especially in mirrors. I think that's interesting. Overall, this deck does have a lot of pumps, like 3 Rebel Assault and 2 Heroic Sacrifice. Not playing any Metal Ceremonies. I still think Metal Ceremony is quite good, but I know that is not always the opinion. All right, and I also did notice that I was covering a couple cards during these reviews. The bottom left 2 have not been viewable. I apologize for that, but hopefully you've been hearing what I say, and that hasn't been too big of an issue. We got a couple more Bobas here. This is another mono yellow. I'm going to skip that and see if this one is a green one. It is. We got a Command Center Boba. So let's look at this one. This is a green Boba, and this looks very similar to the list that won the UK event. I can't tell you how many cards are in it yet. 34, 50. Okay, so it is back down to 50. That one was 54. But the main core here is the same. I know what it looks like was cut here is the Cobb Vanth V-Wing package. Maybe this player wanted a little more aggression and a little less kind of action churning. They are playing 2 Dr. Evazan, so obviously they are trying to get a little more aggro going. But I like the Greedo Salacious Crumb McClunky stuff. I talked about that a little with the Palp. I really like all this top end, like the Vader Maul Reinforcement Walker, Fett's Fire Spray. I think that gets really chunky. You treat this more as a mid-rangey ramp deck that just happens to have the most absurd flip turn in the game, where you can get really far ahead and then your opponent is just behind, and then you start dropping these monsters on curve repeatedly, and that's really cool. In the sideboard, True Sides and Palpatine's return. So I think the True Sides does get a little worse here when you don't have the Cobb V-Wing stuff. Palpatine's return, naturally, I think that card is fantastic. Not even just for cheating out these Force units, but just buyback a Fire Spray is awesome. Buying back a Reinforcement Walker. I think in grindy games, Palpatine is going to be awesome. You got some Lurking Ties in the sideboard, 3 Waylays for Sabine most likely, and past that, I really like Boba Green right now. So this is a deck both the 30 health and Energy Conversion Lab, I think I'm not actually sure yet where I lean, but I think both are very good. And I'm putting a lot of effort right now behind Boba Green. I think the deck, its fit is going to be pretty good right now. All right. We already looked at the one Qi'ra that made it this far. I'm going to see if we find anything. Here's a Rey deck in 15th place. It's a Rey Tarkintown deck. So this is similar to the Han Blue stuff, right? It just gets to play more cheap units to capitalize on Rey's ability, and things like Concord Dawn and Village Protectors become much more annoying with Rey. But other than that, you do lose on that action cheating a lot. You capitalize on Rey being a really good stabilizer into aggro, hopefully, because of all that restore that she provides. But the decks still, I think they function similarly. They are grindy. They are attrition based. They play the full discard package. And yeah. So back to the top 64 page here. Boba definitely did overperform a little bit when it came to making it into the top cut. right? 20% of the field started as Boba, but 31% made it. But it was a top 64, as almost a fourth of the players made it into this mini day 2 tournament. So I don't know how much I can read into that. The other 3 major players, Sabine, Han, and Qi'ra, all kind of underperformed up here, but there's still a ton of like variance in trying to understand this data. So we'll see what happens next time. We'll start solidifying our opinions, but I think it's easy sometimes to like come with an opinion that you already hold and then try to fit that into the data. And I'm probably guilty of that sometimes too. And we need to try to like be as open and understanding that like these numbers, they happened. You can't argue with the numbers, but you can argue a little bit with what they mean sometimes, and whether or not they are telling a full story, or it's just an isolated thing, or like one person was really good and or 10 people were really good and like the numbers went up a lot, or like 10 people, it's the first time playing this deck and their numbers went down a bunch, and it's things, even between this tournament and the one last week, things varied pretty dramatically in some cases, and in some cases they were consistent. So like the more times we see them be consistent, the more times we can start being like, okay, this is a pattern. It is probably bigger than just like play discrepancy now. It's probably at least a little bit matchup discrepancy too. All right, so that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. I know this was a little more off the cuff. Like, I honestly hadn't looked at most of this since I started recording, so like definitely jumped around a bit. Had to like catch my words sometimes. I wasn't like fully prepared to discuss it. So I hope you enjoyed this style. Let me know what you think in the comments. And until next time, take care.